Okay, folks, we're back with item 2, which is positioning. So we are starting from where we left off the last time. I'm going to go ahead and grab this index.html file and drag it over into the Firefox Developer Edition so that I can see what's going on there. I'm not shilling for Firefox, but this is the best browser right now for grid inspecting or using the grid inspector, so keep that in mind. So we can see that our index is the same, our style sheet is updated to reflect what we did the last time. And what we'll do is we'll have 4 column lines and 3 row lines that we can use for alignment. So we have our column lines 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then our row lines 1, 2, and 3. And so we will go ahead and alter the code a bit to add in column and row position for individual items. So again, you can see my notes over here, what I'm doing here. So card 1, we're going to change to grid column 1 of 3 and then grid row 1. So card 1, because I'm fundamentally lazy, I'm just going to copy this and paste it. So the grid column command 1 to 3, and then the grid row 1, the logic of this command is going to be that it's going to span from now column 1 through 3, and it's going to start at grid row 1 and then end at the next grid row. So let's save that, make sure we saved it, and take a look over in the Developer Edition, and when we do that, there's not a fraction, there's not a dash here. Okay, so for card 1, it should now go between grid columns 1 and 3, and it does. And so we can see that now automatically the rest of these layouts, or the rest of these items are laid out on the grid until they finally finish, fill it all the way up down here at the bottom. So that's the basics of positioning. And the command, grid column 1, 3, has the logic of starting it at column 1 and ending it at column 3. And then grid row 1 just starts it at grid row 1. I'm going to copy and paste these commands over here so we can see what's going on with some of those grid columns and rows. And we will see how these things will then span going from there. Back over into Atom. I don't want to open Slack right now. So we'll go ahead and add this code down to the bottom of the page, save the page, we'll refresh over here, and when we do that, we can see that now the grid has actually gotten a little bit bigger. This is sort of interesting. It's grown to be able to have more grid rows and grid items because we would define more grid rows and grid items here than we had previously. If we look at the overlay grid, we can see that we have more line and row numbers now, and column. We have more row numbers than we previously had, and we have more column numbers than we previously had. So that's kind of nice to know that your stuff won't just sort of overflow out into nowhere from the grid. It'll actually adjust itself if you have more content than you predicted, or if you have more information than you predicted going in there. We can also use that to add empty space within layouts. So if we define something like, if we change the card 3 display to look something like this, for example, where's my card 3? I'll just overwrite that. So it goes from 2, 4 to 3, 4 in the grid row. When we save that page and we refresh it over here, what we'll see is that then that item will start here and we have empty space that's flowing in here. So we can use that to add sort of like white space to our layouts, which is pretty nice to be able to have. Or you could put something else in that layout if you wanted to, all that sort of stuff. So the second way to do this positioning piece is with what's called the named areas property for positioning, where we give each card a name with the grid area property. So I'm going to clear out this code, and this is all again in the finish.css file that we have here, as well as being in my notes that you can see here. But we'll give each of these cards a name for a grid area. I don't know why I named card 1 A and card 2 B. It would probably make more logical sense to name it like grid area 1. Don't know, don't have a lot to tell you about that. But what we can do then is we can actually go through and tell these grid template areas where to live. And actually I'm remembering that I need to put this up above where my cards are. We'll define the grid areas first. And then here in the cards themselves, this is kind of neat. I can like draw basically on the screen what the grid template areas are going to be. So check this out, it's neat. So the grid template areas gets a colon after it, and note the syntax here. This whole thing ends with a semicolon, so it's like any other CSS command where you have a colon, a semicolon. But here I'm putting the rows into areas where I have a quote mark around each of them. I'm using the named areas that I defined up here to say this card 1 goes in area A, card 2 goes in area B. The dot is for a blank space, and then the semicolon here, like I said, ends this whole thing here. So let's save that and take a look at what happens when we do that over here. And what we should see, yep, so we have A, B, this is an empty space. Card 3 is down here because we called it number 3, and then 4 and 5 are over here. So it's the same layout that we just had, just kind of a different way to skin that individual cat. And now what we can see is that when we overlay the grid here and we look at it in the web inspector, we have our named areas here, so we can see A, B, D, so on and so forth. So when you're doing this, one of the important things to keep in mind is that you can run stuff vertically or horizontally. So I could run, item A here vertically like this. I could change it like that, save and refresh the page, and now my area A winds up here. I can't dogleg things. I can't have content dogleg over an area. I couldn't have card A, B in 3 different spots. And when you do that and your layout winds up looking like this, it just kind of blows up. You've done something along those lines. You've tried to run it across a couple of different areas. But you can see that the template areas is a pretty powerful way to be able to do this, to be able to say, hey, I can tell this where to go. And for some people who are, who think differently visually, some things that we have here, then what we can do is to be able to position it, kind of there as we've defined it on the screen. All right, moving on to number 3 in the next video.